It happened most dramatically in his dabbling with the planchette and Ouija boards. And he relates this experience in a talk he gave in Miracles in 1914. He's explaining his own experience with the Ouija board and things like that. Quote, "In my boyhood, I worked with the planchette, and though I am perfectly willing to admit that I may have gone mad for the time being, or that there were resources in my subconsciousness I should never have imagined to exist, if anybody tells me that it was either cheating or done by my own will, I will say it is nonsense. The thing ran across the table a good deal longer than this by which I am standing, with a violent pull. There was something undoubtedly behind it, and it was not either of the two people working it. I simply put this in my own personal testimony, and I also came to the conclusion afterwards that it was a bad experiment, and I would not go on with it. That is, I fear that I would not go on with it." So he had, as a youngster, some personal experience of influence of evil spirits. Another college student he met, in a conversation with him, this guy was talking about some very sordid things he was thinking of doing. And he said, and Chesterton said that this comment by him kind of changed his whole mental outlook. The guy said, "If I should do that, I should never know the difference between good and evil." And Chesterton called this person the diabolist. That is, it was such a statement that you could do something and you would no longer know the difference between good and evil. And he said this was a turning point in his life. He said, "This remark left in my mind forever a certitude upon the objective solidity of sin." The objective solidity of sin. And it's very significant. He didn't call this person the impressionist or the decadent or the skeptic, but he called him the diabolist, that he sensed there was something really evil in such a mindset. Maybe some of you know William Oddy. He's a great writer in England. He has written a very important book on Chesterton called Chesterton and the Romance of Orthodoxy. And it's his opinion that in Chesterton's writings at the time and what he was reading of the writings of the time, he saw something diabolical going on in the culture itself. Another source of his understanding of the evil spirits. Now, I'll just read you, this is Oddy's quote from his book. "It is not simply that the end of the period was a period in which men had gone mad. It was a time when they were possessed by a great evil, in which the city of Mansoul," that's Bunyan's other great work, The Holy War, his allegory, "in which the city of Mansoul was besieged by hosts of the devil." And then this sentence here is very significant for Chesterton's intellectual development. He said, "Chesterton's orthodoxy begins not simply with the perception of unorthodoxy, of intellectual incoherence or aberration, but with a vision of positive evil." This is the early 20th century. That something evil was going on in the culture. It was another source of his awareness of who he was combating. And he quotes Chesterton, writing in this period, "I never, even in this first vague and skeptical age, indulged very much in the current arguments about the relativity of evil or the unreality of sin. Perhaps I was one of the few people in that world of diabolism who really believed in devils." So it's quite extraordinary that somebody, a young man at that time, had this belief when the devils were being rationalized away or psychologized away. Well, it's part of a grace that he had in his own development. It's Adi's contention that Chesterton saw personal powers of evil at work in the world in which he was growing up. Now, another source of Chesterton's awareness of the dark side was something in his own personal experience. I call it the dark side. In the last few years, there's been a number of authors giving their opinions about this, the dark side, they call it, of Chesterton's character. And in one article in the Chesterton Review, the author says, "I am merely suggesting that there is another side of Chesterton that has become more significant and more salient in recent decades." But I want to quote an excerpt from one of Chesterton's letters to Monsignor Ronald Knox, who was fairly influential in his conversion to the church, not the only influence, but he was a very close friend of the family. But this reveals Chesterton's other side. We think of Chesterton as, very lighthearted and joking all the time, but there is, I believe myself, this other side to him, and this is his own personal testimony about his experience. Writing to Monsignor Knox, "I have as much vanity as anybody about any of these superficial successes." He's talking about his public speaking and debates that he won while they are going on. "But I never feel for a moment that they affect the reality of whether I am utterly rotten or not." Now, nobody would ever say that about Chesterton himself, but he's talking about some of his own experience that he has, so that any public comments on my religious position seem like a wind on the other side of the world, as if they were about somebody else, as indeed they are. And I am concerned about what has become of a little boy whose father showed him a toy theater, and a schoolboy whom nobody ever heard of with his brooding on doubts and dirt and daydreams, of crude conscientiousness, so inconsistent as to be near hypocrisy. And then this line here, talking about himself in all the morbid life of the lonely mind of a person with whom I have lived. It is that story that so often came near to ending badly, but I wanted to end well. So he attributes these things to himself, not only an experience of bad things happening in the world, but when he said, "What's wrong with the world? I am," and he wasn't joking. In his autobiography, when he speaks about the conclusion of The Man Who Was Thursday, he wrote, "Even in the earliest days, and even for the worst reasons, I already knew too much to pretend to get rid of evil. So I introduced at the end one figure who really does, with the full understanding, deny and defy the good. I put that statement into the story, testifying to the extreme evil, which is merely unpardonable, the unpardonable sin of not wishing to be pardoned, not because I had learned it from any of a million priests I had never met, but because I had learned it from myself." And for you, those of you who have read the novel, that's really Sunday, the figure at the end that he makes as the to emphasize that part of reality. No doubt somebody has psychoanalyzed Chesterton as to the source of these feelings, or somebody will. But I offer one possible partial explanation as regards the source of these personal estimations. And Father mentioned that one of the books I wrote recently about Chesterton, about his mysticism. And I believe he received a real mystical grace. And basically it was about awareness of the experience of God in the world, and God actually continuing creation all the time. But the point I make is that mystics, you often read that before they have received grace, they're often given some very terrible experience of their own sinfulness. I've often come across that in Teresa of Avila or other mystics. It's kind of a preparation for the graces they're about to receive. And I believe that Chesterton also received a profound experience of his own sinfulness, the ability that he had to deny God like everybody else. So that's again my interpretation, but I think that is also another source of his understanding of the dark side of the world, that we all possess something of that in ourselves. He was asked once what he thought about hell. He said he thought it's a place to be avoided. And he's never actually been there himself or met anybody who had been there. But would it be possible in such an experience to get a taste of hell? In this time of preparation for grace, is it possible to get a taste of what abandonment might be? How many of you have read his play Magic? I suggest that in the context of this talk. It's about, it was fashionable in those times to invite magicians to the parlor and to do tricks for everybody. And so that's what the play is about. But there's one trick, a light across the field that changes color, and at the magician's beckoning. And one of the guys in the party is a skeptic, and he's going crazy because he can't understand how he's doing this trick. And somebody tells him, tell this guy something because he's going crazy. But he decides not to tell him, but somebody else asks him, what did you tell Morris? That's the skeptic. And the magician, he calls him the conjurer, says, I shall not tell you. And the guy says, why not? And the magician says, because God and the demons and that immortal mystery that you deny has been in this room tonight. Because you know it has been here, because you have felt it here, because you know the spirits as well as I do and fear them as much as I do. And then he has this magician say, I dabbled a little in table rapping and table turning. Chesterton might be taking his own experience. But soon I had reason to give it up. And a woman in the asked, but why did you give it up? The magician said, it began to give me headaches. It began to give Chesterton headaches too, when he went to these Ouija board things. And I found that every morning after a spiritualist seance, I had a queer feeling of lowness and degradation, of having been soiled. And it wasn't long before the spirits with whom I had been playing that table turning did what I think they generally do at the end of all such table turning. They turned the tables. They turned the tables on me. So my point in the book is that it's very significant that for his first play, and probably the most popular play, it's about the actual presence of evil spirits, that this magician was in cahoots. And it was real magic in the story. And that changing of the light was not done by... And one of the great commentaries on Chesterton, he wrote this: the play is arguing the case for an unfashionable belief in the reality of the power of evil. And Chesterton himself said about this play, quote, all the people in magic are purposely made good so that there shall be no villain except the great invisible villain. No, it's very significant, I think, that for his first play, that Bernard Shaw kept pushing him to write a play. For his first play, he chose a story that is proof of the presence of evil spirits sometimes involved in these magical tricks. So I think this is an unambiguous, significant confirmation of how Chesterton understood what his lifelong battle was all about. Perhaps some of you have read his book, The Everlasting Man, about Christ, which was very significant in the life of C.S. Lewis. And in the opening paragraphs of a chapter called Demons and Philosophers, Chesterton gives some very truly penetrating insights as to the influence of devils on civilizations as a whole. If you ever come across that book. And one of his insights that should give us more than pause, is that communication with them is a phenomenon which occurs not for the most part in so-called primitive stages of civilization, but rather in its developed stages. And this is a quote from that book. All over the world, the traces can be found of this striking and solid fact, so curiously overlooked by the moderns who speak of all such evil as primitive and early in evolution. And that, as a matter of fact, some of the very highest civilizations of the world were the very places where the horns of Satan were exalted, not only to the stars, but in the face of the sun. And so this chapter in The Everlasting Man, I recommend to you, it's probably the most extensive and penetrating treatment of the influence of demons upon civilizations as a whole. You might find it very important for our own times. And in this book, The Everlasting Man, is one of the best books you could read about Christ. Chesterton wrote it for people who had never heard of Christ. Kind of hard, because we've read so much, heard so much, it's hard to read the Gospels kind of for the first time. But he tried to write it as if the reader had never heard anything about Christ. And the devil, he says, is at the center of Christ's understanding of his mission in battle. So this is one of my favorite quotes from Chesterton. Many people point to Christ as a great poet, or a prophet, or a moralist. In many ways, he is very much alive to modern people. But if anyone really set off to discover Christ, that is, read the gospel as if for the first time, with unprejudiced eyes, what would she or he discover? It is that the exorcist towers above the poet and even the prophet. That the story between Cana and Calvary is one long war with demons. He understood better than 100 poets the beauty of the flowers of the battlefield, but he came out to do battle. And if most of his words mean anything at all, they do mean that there is at our very feet, like a chasm concealed among the flowers, an unfathomable evil. Pretty strong words. Again, Chesterton, the language of the gospel seems to me to go much more singly to a single issue. The voice that is heard there has such authority as speaks to any army, and the highest note of it is victory rather than peace. And when the disciples were first sent forth with their faces to the four corners of the earth, and turned again to acclaim their master, he did not say in that hour of triumph, these are some of my favorite lines, he did not say to them, all are aspects of one harmonious whole, when they came back from there. Or, all things find their end in nirvana. Or, the dewdrop slips into the shining sea. He looked up and said, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. That's what he saw as a result of their teaching. We're going to talk a little bit about the novel The Ball and the Cross, and I'd like to emphasize that this is probably Chesterton's most sustained treatment of the temptations of the evil spirit. I mentioned that William Audy referred to Bunyan's second allegory, the Holy War. And in that book, there's often council sessions of the bad guys talking about how they're going to conduct their war. And when I read that, I haven't read the whole novel, but I did it for research. It reminded me something of the Screwtape Letters, and I often wondered if C.S. Lewis got any of his inspiration from these caricatures that were in this novel. For example, this is one of the discussions the bad guys have. They're trying to overcome the city of Mansoul that has been taken from them. And they say, let us assault them in all pretended fairness, covering our intentions with all manner of lies, flatteries, delusive words, feigning things that will never be, and promising them that which they shall never find. What we promise them will, in the end, believe us, especially if in all our lies and feigned words we pretend great love to them, and that our design is only their advantage and honor. So this is kind of a satanic temptations. And so Ade conjectures that Mansoul was one of Chesterton's muses in his understanding of his battle, the battle with Satan. So in The Ball of the Cross, there's these two guys, one is an atheist and one is a fervent Catholic. And they believe so much in their convictions that they want to fight a duel. But people are against them, mostly because they think there's no such thing as truth, and so there's no sense in fighting any duels. And one of the characters in Ball and the Cross is called Professor Lucifer, obviously who it is. But on page after page in this novel, Professor Lucifer is giving out false ideas about the church, about Christ, about truth. And it's just filled with, I think, Chesterton's understanding of how in some ways, Satan can tempt us. So this understanding of Satan was always in Chesterton's mind, background. And Ade says, a nightmare which fades with the light of day, but which is never finally forgotten. Chesterton is always aware of this kind of battle. There's not simply against human ideologies, but it's something on a much spiritual level. Perhaps some of you are aware of Robert Hugh Benson's Lord of the World, written around the same time, and also Solovyev's Antichrist, Story of the Antichrist. And in some ways, Chesterton's Ball and the Cross, it's not as apocalyptic as these two novels, but it was the turn of the century, just like the turn of for us, the year 2000, all kind of apocalyptic genres coming out. So Chesterton's Ball and the Cross is kind of it's part of an apocalyptic genre. It's not about the end of the world, but Chesterton says it's about the end of something. So, but I think it's in the same genre as Benson's novel, The Lord of the World. Benson knew about Chesterton. He had read some of his writings, so there's some relationship there. At the end of Chesterton's book, the New Jerusalem, we have a summing up in a way of this aspect of Chesterton's life and writings. and what I think is a succinct statement of the thesis of my book. And in a very few paragraphs, Chesterton is talking about the mind, fairy tales, theology, drama, all areas to which he applied his great mind. But if battle is an all-pervasive theme in his writings, in his own mind it is a battle also with this unfathomable evil at our very feet. And here he relates this theme to all four areas that I mentioned. For example, the area of the mind. This is all kind of in a half paragraph, half a page. In the realm of the mind. In all our brains, certainly in mine, were buried things as bad as any buried under that bitter sea. He's talking about the pigs that were cast into the sea in the Matthew's Gospel. And if he did not come to do battle with them, even in the darkness of the brain of man, I know not why he came. Certainly, it was not only to talk about flowers and socialism. That's not why he came. And in the area of fairy tales, some of which he has written himself, he says, the more truly we can see life as a fairy tale, the more clearly the tale resolves itself into war with the dragon that is wasting the fairyland. And at the heart of many fairy tales. And in theology, I remember distinguished men among liberal theologians who found it more difficult to believe in one than in many. They admitted in the New Testament an attestation to evil spirits, but not to a general enemy of mankind. And then in the field of drama, as some are said to want the drama of Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark, they would have the drama of hell without the Prince of Darkness. And so a very important aspect of Chesterton's prophetic and apologetic mission, by the way, is being considered, I think myself, one of the great apologists of certainly the 20th century. He's drawn thousands of people into the church because he had to work through in his own mind what he called the tangles of the mind to the faith. And so he understands the journey that people have to take. So he's one of the great apologists, and part of his mission was keeping alive, if we can put it that way, in the reality of evil spirits, which is part of our faith. Well, not the most cheery part of his legacy. It is an essential dimension of the truth of the gospel. And it is a testimony to his greatness that he did not shirk from the most difficult truths of the Christian faith. You probably know that there's a possibility of a cause for canonization starting in England. It hasn't started yet, but someone has been appointed to look into the possibility. And when it gets underway, as I'm sure it will, the church will pay particular attention not so much to his theory of distributism or his literary criticism as to his understanding of the faith. And that's why I think my book on his mysticism will be helpful in that regard too. Our belief in Satan forms part of that faith understanding. And the fact that Chesterton's battle with Satan was an essential part of his life's work will only deepen the church's conviction that he was indeed a defender of the faith, which he was called before or after his death. I'd like to conclude that if Chesterton was fighting against Satan, I think the devil was fighting against Chesterton as well. Because anybody with that kind of intellectual ability to convince people to the Catholic faith, they have to certainly be an object of his attacks. And as one of the great apologists of our time, perhaps of all time, I think the bad guys were warring against him as well. it's significant that even though Chesterton is considered one of the great writers of the 20th century, there's very little in academia about his study and his writings. Maybe he's too Catholic for most universities. But I think the devil would rather they study Nietzsche or anybody else but people like Chesterton, because it might attract people to something like the Catholic faith. They might sneak into the library and read one of his books. So keep that in your prayers as well, that it's not only Chesterton fighting them, but I think they very much would not like to have him very prominent. But there is a mini renewal going on among in the world about Chesterton. And one of the very great things about him was that even though he was consciously fighting what he called this unfathomable evil at our feet, consciously fighting, he was also one of the most joyful men who ever lived. That he was able to keep that perspective in his life. So thank you very much.